Hi there, and welcome to Reflections in Veterinary Education. So happy that you decided to join us today. This is going to be a journal club edition of Rive. And so this, I chose an article, actually kind of had the idea after our last episode, talked a little bit about, I don't like just offhand mentioned improvisation. And I was like, ooh, I should do a search and see what we have in the literature. So I found this article. It's in Medical Science Educator from 2020. It's a short communication entitled Medical Improvisation Training for All Medical Students, 3-year experience by David Fessel and colleagues. So just a little backstory. So I was in an improv group in undergrad. It was like one of those random things, like in my first year of college, and people were like, hey, we're going to go do this thing. And it's like, okay, cool. Met some people and they were like, oh, we're starting an improv group. It's like, yeah, you should try. Okay, sure. Whatever. Like I did it for 4 years. It was awesome. I friggin' loved it. And we just like performed around campus, and there was like a coffee shop that paid us like $50 a show or something like that, which is amazing. And we had so much fun with it. And so I am very biased, but I think the skills from doing improv is translatable to all sorts of things. So that's 100%, my bias reading this. But yeah, that was partly what, prompted me to see like what's out there in the literature on using improvisation training in medical education. And not surprisingly, this was, communication based, like, they were focusing on how does this impact communication. I couldn't really find anything on how improvisation training might help in other aspects of medical education or what we do in our jobs. And then I can, imagine other things, but I've already talked way too much. I don't think either of you have even had a word yet in the show. So yeah, that's kind of where I came from with this article. So what were your guys' thoughts first when you saw the topic and just kind of your general impressions? All right,
Eric,
Kathy, you go first.
Oh, you want me to go first?
Sure. Yeah.
So I actually took an improv workshop from one of the authors of this particular paper.
What? I did not know that when I selected it.
Yeah. I was like, oh, I know Yvonne. Cool. Yeah, so it was an interesting experience. It wasn't necessarily related specifically to, well, it was a medical training workshop, but I was going through my PhD program for a different reason. So I definitely am not the kind of person who likes to do improv, because I'm not the kind of person who likes to get up and perform. I learned that very quickly when I was a performance music major in my undergraduate career. I get terrible stage fright. It's not my thing. But there are definitely aspects to it that I have actually incorporated in other workshops about education. So I am not surprised that you were able to find something. And it was sort of kind of a full circle moment for me last time when we were talking about this. So yeah, so I'll leave it there until we get more into the meat of the conversation, because it seems like maybe Eric's the only one who really hasn't had a lot of experience with it, or maybe you have. I don't know.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like you're going to.
Maybe he has.
Hear it. All right, Eric.
I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles, so it was just like all around. Like we did that in high school and like these kinds of things. But I play a lot of role-playing games, and vast majority of role-playing games like D&D kinds of things is improv. But the favorite show that I watch is run by an improv guy, and a lot of the actors are improv, and 90% of the game is improv. So those skills definitely apply, and I have since acquired a lot of those watching the improvers and being like, oh yeah, that's a fun way to run a game. I'm going to try to do that. And I think that, where Bobby, you were like, where does it go elsewise in our teaching? I think that it probably does inform how we communicate with the students, and like when they ask us a question, like where we go with that question, and like the yes and it's like, yeah, like don't shut a student down when they're like, Dr. Hoffmeister, is it like this? No, like there's nowhere to go from there, right? Like there's nothing to be learned. So like if you yes and the student, be like, well, it's not quite right, like maybe you're thinking like this, and this is the way it really is. So
yeah. I also think about it. I mean, because every day of our lives, right, we're improvising, right? It's not like there's a script for, every part of every day, but like for improv, it's usually there's some structure to it, right? So like whether you're talking about D&D or it's a performance or whatever, we're saying there are some rules, and you kind of have to stay within these rules. But from there, there's a lot of different ways this can go. And so I like that idea that it's somewhat structured, but not so, it's not scripted, right? So there's structure, there's scaffolding, but there's a lot of room within that. And I feel like medicine is that way as well, right? Like there is a vague structure. You can think of anesthesia, like there's a general structure, but like I can get a little creative with, how I want to do this, what medication do I want to do here? And so I think of it also as to some degree, that's what we do in, our like treatment of patients. There's some improvisation as well. And when you get new information, whether that's from a partner who's performing with you or from the patient itself or a colleague, you go, okay, I have to take in that new information. And certainly in my world, in emergency, I have to think on my feet, right? So there's a lot of that. I don't have time to stop and study the script and go back and memorize my lines and then come back and perform. No, I have to perform right now. And I think some of those fears of having to think on your feet and make a decision, and what if I screw up? I do like the idea of some of those, the feelings of like being put on the spot can translate as well. And so that's where my brain went with this, like, oh, now I need to do like I have time, but now I need to do an improv study to be like, how can this impact actually like medical decision making? That's where I think it has like some potential as well. Again, this one was more communication based, which hugely important as well. But I was like, we can expand.
Well, actually, I agree with that, because I think one of the things that I, was sort of like, oh, well, yeah, communication's great. We do a lot of great communications training, but at the same time, I'm thinking about students who just want the right answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because as you're talking about sort of this structure that's a little bit fluid and a little bit loose, what students want is this,
yes.
And what medicine is this,
yep.
Right? It's sort of like
messy
thing. And students are really uncomfortable in that. So if we can get them to be more comfortable in that moment and sort of that response, while not necessarily just blurting out everything that they're thinking at the same time, but understanding that sometimes that's okay. Maybe it would help them be more comfortable in the moment, making decisions, and then just going back and having that time to reflect. Because I mean, that's in my experience, that's what students want. What's the right answer? What's the right answer? How do I get to the right answer? And it's like, well, there's like 42 right answers, and there's about 58 ways to get to those right answers. So which one do you want? Right. And that's not what they want.
I just need your answer to match your justification. That's it. I just need you to demonstrate for me that how you got from point A to point B. And I can be like, okay, yeah, that seems.
And even if it's wrong, even if you got to point A and then you went to point C and then you came back to point B and maybe you didn't need to go to point C, let me understand that, because that's okay. Now I can help you understand maybe a shorter way to get there, right? It doesn't mean that it's wrong unless,
sometimes it is. If I know your thought process, right? If I know your thought process, I can also say, oh, okay, yes, I understand why you thought that. Okay, here's where this was off a little bit. But yeah, so this article was kind of fun for me. Like I was going back to, when they were describing the different games that they were playing and gave like a brief description. I'm like, oh, I want more description of this stuff. And I was going back to like some of the games that we played. None of these were games that we played for improv because we were solely trying to entertain people. But although I imagine some of these were quite entertaining. But I mean, so essentially, this group, when you said, Catherine, that you took a class, I was like, was it Alan Alda?
It wasn't. My buddy got to meet Alan Alda. He had a great time with him. It was Yvonne Kaplan-Litz. She actually helped found the Alan Alda Center for Communications at SUNY. And now she's at the Texas Christian University Med School. So
nice. I just like the idea, like that you have an actor, a well-known actor who's like, yeah, this is a useful skill, because I think that is pretty common in acting worlds, is like to do various improv things, because it makes them, for depending on what you want to do, makes them better, particularly in, comedic actors. But so there's a large group of people that work to develop this course. So, I mean, there was a lot of effort put into the development of it. And then, they had 3 years worth of survey results from the students who participated. And Yeah. So I guess maybe we start, it was like we're like halfway through here, but as like a journal club, any thoughts on maybe how they designed their study here, or what are your guys' thoughts on the design, the methods?
So I have two things that it makes me think of. One is, thinking about like Kirkpatrick's model of evaluation. Like level 1 is like, did the students like it? Level 2 is, did it change their behavior? Or did they learn it? Level 3 is, did it change their behavior? Level 4 is, did it change the organization or institution? I realized that was not designed for education, but we've kind of adopted it and applied it. And I don't know, it makes intuitive sense to me. And so I like it, and a lot of studies use it. And so that's kind of where I started with this. I'm like, okay, so you found out that the students like it. Like, great. That's the step number 1. If they don't like it, they're not going to learn it. Yep. But then they didn't get to, did they learn it? They did ask retroactively, they asked the students, did you apply these, activities? It's like, okay, well then that's recall, bias. And did they really do it? And those kinds of things. So I think that it was good from that standpoint, but it made me think about it okay, they didn't necessarily demonstrate learning or application, which is fine. It's not necessarily the point of the study. And the second thought that I had is that I think that biomedical researchers get down on educational research because they read studies like this and they're like, this wouldn't fly in any biomedical journal. This is nonsense. Why are we, paying attention to this? It's one university and just a descriptive study. What do we do with this? And I think that, for our listeners and viewers, the idea of educational research, we're all biomedical scientists and we're not trained as educational researchers. And I think that creates a problem for us understanding and interpreting and applying educational research principles, that it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't even necessarily need to be quote unquote good from the way a biomedical researcher would do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a different set of criteria that you're judging it against.
And different goals. Yeah.
So I wanted more, right? I was one of those people that was like, okay, I know this is a short communication. I like the description, but I just want a little bit more meat to it. And so one of the things that they talk about is, medical improvise. I have this underlying medical improvisation is based in Kolb's experiential learning and Bandura's social learning theory. That's fantastic. Tell me more, right? Because if you're somebody who doesn't understand Kolb's experiential learning theory, and I would argue that Kolb's experiential learning, I don't know it, but it's actually not Kolb's, it's probably somebody else's, I don't know, Piaget or Vygotsky or something. But Bandura's social learning theory, that's awesome. Okay, well, I have no idea what the hell that means. So give me a little bit more there. Help me understand how this is connected. And I think that might speak to your, and again, understanding that they probably had a word limit, right? Because this is a brief communication. But for people who are reading this that are really interested in and just don't have that background, can you just give me a few sentences about how it's sort of, grounded in this, and what is Kolb's experiential learning theory, and why is that relevant to this kind of thing? And so I wanted a little bit more meat, but I'm coming at it from the background of somebody who does have quite a bit of educational experience. And I'm like, I don't know if somebody who doesn't have that is going to really, well,
that's what, no, it's actually a blending. That's what really struck me is if you look at how this entire manuscript was written, it's written like a typical biomedical research study where you have a short introduction, just give you just a little bit, and then we're going to tell you everything we did, and we'll spend more time at the end with the discussion. And when I was just starting to learn and get exposed to more education research, and it's no, your introduction is going to be the longest part of your paper, right? And I was like, I'm sorry, what? Because I've always thought keep that as brief as possible, just give them a taste, send them where they all. So I think when they were writing this, they were writing it as, my guess is, a lot of people were involved, or maybe the editors, or, depending on where how this was, but that just the structure of it felt more like a typical biomedical study in the way it was written versus a typical education report where you're going to delve into the literature and let's talk about the theory and why is this theory apply and there's a lot more. Like your whole literature search should be, sometimes half or more of the entire paper. So yeah, the wanting more is fair. And again, who knows what the limitations or restrictions were. Like I said, it was a short communication, but it's like, all right, best of luck to you. Go figure that out on your own.
I know. And I guess
I do. It almost felt like a reviewer made a comment like, there's no theory in here. And they're like, okay, this is our response to that reviewer.
Yep.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that frustrates me about folks who say I'm an educator or I'm a medical educator, but they don't actually have the background to back that up because, and again, I'm not saying that experience is worthless. Experience is very important. Obviously, you can be an academic with no experience that's as worthless as somebody who has lots of experience and no academic experience. But to me, if you're going to call yourself an educator, then you need to be able to explain the educational jargon, the educational language. And I have read enough educational research articles by people who don't have that background or who haven't decided to take the time to really dig into it or talk to somebody who does have that background to be able to kind of say, well, I think you're trying to kind of convince people that you know more than you do about this and just come out and say, we don't really have a lot of experience with this. We've talked to other people about it and this is kind of what seems to make sense for us, but we see these things happening and isn't this great? And I would feel better about that than these people who just sort of pick things out and say, oh, well, this sounds really good. It sounds like it matches that. And I'm just going to talk about it and then don't really back it up with me. And that may not be the case at all in this situation. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it sort of felt like that, even though I love the idea of it. And I think there's some really good stuff in there.
And they did good stuff. Yeah. Like it's not that, like you said, it was more just, let's dig into the why, and, or not even the why, but the theory behind, how could this potentially be impact's because that is really helpful. But kind of what you're saying, Catherine. So when I was first getting into this, I was given advice is like, you don't have to be an expert in education, things like that, but just get out there and like publish, just write up what you're doing. And, and this very, just like get out there, it's not so bad. They're pretty nice over there, which is true. People are really nice in veterinary education. But it was this kind of like, I think about it now and it's like, it was really kind of like, and it was not from somebody who was an education specialist.
Yeah.
If you didn't guess that, but, but it was kind of this like, this is like, it's a pseudoscience. You don't really have to, it's not a very robust process. And, you just kind of write something down and you can get it published. And, I've now reviewed some submissions for some of the journals and been like, yep, somebody was given that advice. It was just like, write down what you do. And that's probably publishable. And it's like,
which is really interesting as biomedical scientists, because I would never be like, yeah, Eric, you don't know anything about internal medicine, but I mean, you've seen enough cases. Just go ahead and write it down. It'll be fine. Somebody will publish it. Like, who does that?
Can you imagine if I just wrote like a diary of what I did in a week and was like, and here's what I do in the clinic. And I feel like this will be valuable for people, because you're also in the clinic and maybe this is how I do my stuff. Like, can you imagine trying to get that published?
But you know what? That's basically what some qualitative methods are, and I'm hearing you describe that. I'm like, I've read that paper, not exactly, but like ethnographies are like you go and you observe the thing.
But there's theory under it, there's structure to it. And I guess I think my point is like, I think what your point is, Eric, is true. And like for Bobby to write like what I do in a week, that actually might be interesting and publishable.
I mean, my life pretty interesting.
Well, I'm sure that it is. But what I'm saying is that let's say you decided to sit down and write about your experience with building Lego bridges and how you feel like that was really transferable to, building the next Golden Gate Bridge because you've done it and you slept at a Holiday Inn last night. Like, that's what I think a lot of people think of as educational research, right? Like, I've done it. I can write about it. It's fine. And then I've had enough conversations with people who are like, well, I'm really kind of interested in pursuing, education and maybe doing a PhD after my vet school. What education program do you think I should get? And I was like, well, okay, so what kind of education do you want to do? And they're like, wait, what do you mean? I'm like, well, do you want to learn about K-12 education? Do you want to learn about higher education? Do you want to learn about administration? Do you want to learn about higher education leadership? Do you want to learn about educational leadership? Do you want to become a principal? Do you want to become a secondary science teacher, a primary science teacher, a university science teacher? Do you want to learn about science education, mathematics education, curriculum instruction? And they're like, whoa, I had no idea. I'm like, yeah, and now I've added sports pedagogy, right? Do you want to learn about sports pedagogy? So there's all these things, and they're like, I had no idea that you could do so many different things in education. I'm like, yeah, you kind of have to figure out what it is you want to do in education before you can decide what kind of program you want to go to, just like you do in veterinary medicine or human medicine or engineering or psychology. But people are just like, oh, it's just education. It's, it's just education. It's no big deal. So, and again, I'm not saying that these authors feel that way at all. I've actually interacted, obviously, with one of them who does not feel that way. But I think your point, Bobby, about how it's written very much like a biomedical science thing, which is interesting to me because the publisher is the International Association of Medical Science Educators, IMC, which is I'm a member of and is a pretty big medical medical education organization. But yeah, it definitely was fit into sort of this little thing that maybe, and maybe if they hadn't had that constraint, it would have, been a little bit more.
Yeah, that's where I'm wondering, was it, because it's a short communication, they had a word limit and they were like, well, we really, because I'm not really sure where they could have cut in the other parts, so I get it, but I think it's still worth talking about how, kind of lopsided the typical article might be. And so when, like, if you're reading and you're not used to reading education articles and you see like, oh my gosh, the introduction is going on, you're like, yeah, that's how it's supposed to be. That's totally normal.
I don't understand why this is 6,000 words. And the educational researcher's like, it was 8,000 words. I had to cut 2,000 words out.
I will say that I am one of those people that is like, just write it up. But I have to explain this a little bit.
Good,
I'm not like, yeah, just go write it up. But what happens is like faculty come to me and they're like, hey, I have this thing that I want to try. And I'm like, cool, let's be systematic about it. Let's collect some data around it. It's not going to be that much more work than what you're doing already in trying that thing. But then you'll get some hopefully interesting, useful data that could be publishable. So I think that what I would want listeners to kind of take away from is like, oh, if I'm like systematic and approach it, from a like scientific standpoint and have it, based on theory, I can do my teaching and collect data about that. And that is useful.
Absolutely.
You're not telling people to just write it up, though. I think you're undermining what you're actually doing, because when you're
providing mentorship
you're not like, hey, Bobby, just write a journal and send it in. You're like, okay, that sounds like a really great idea. People might be interested in that. How are you going to approach that? How are you going to structure that? What kind of theory you're going to base it on? And I think it's that theory part that most people, especially in qualitative, that they forget about, right? Is this idea that we really need to ground what we're talking about in a theory. And that to me is what makes the difference between like somebody just writing it up and somebody actually doing research, is understanding that theory and making those connections. So I think
also trying to think about it in advance, right? It's not like, here's the thing I've done, and now I'm just going to describe it and hopefully somebody will find that useful. Now that could also be really helpful too. And sometimes that is, you're like, oh, I experienced this thing and it surprised me. And so then I researched it and turns out that, there's a phenomenon that kind of fits with what I experienced. And so, so you can, quote unquote, just write things up, but there's work involved. It's not just a journal entry. It's not just like, today I did this and the student said that. Because even if you're doing like an autoethnography, right, there's still like planning that has to go in and thinking about how is this going to be impactful, and like reflecting is like, what do I have to contribute? Like, do I have something worthwhile to say? Like, so yes, I mean, I think it's a good point though, Eric. Like, I don't want to discourage people from trying things, but I also don't want to, minimize the importance of doing it well, to get people thinking,
for sure,
anything up and they'll publish anything. We want people to read it and take it seriously too.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah, good point.
For sure.
Which I think we all agree on that, but okay. So, so we want a little bit more in the intro, but that's okay. thoughts on, you know, kind of the methods of the paper, kind of how they either organized the course itself, or just collected the data.
Do you want to give a like just a brief summary for the reader
Oh yeah,
or
that's fair.
listener?
Okay. So it was 3 years worth of, so 3 years that this course was held. And the student, I'm going to look and make sure I get the details right, but basically there was a medical improvisation workshop, for 3rd year medical students. And they were in, I don't remember what size groups they were in, but it wasn't like all of the, you know, the entire class at the time, but they had different groups. And they had designed programs specifically for this. And it did change between, I think the first 2 years was the same, and then it was a little different in the 3rd year, or maybe the 2nd and 3rd year. I can't remember for sure. So they weren't exactly the same. Some of the students had some additional activities that they did, but they had these, you know, these workshops where the students practiced different improvisational games, and they described the games in there. And then they asked students, you know, to evaluate the workshop. Like, what did you think? Did you find this beneficial? You know, what some of the questions, did you feel you gained any insight about yourself relevant to your role as a physician? And then, you know, so it's all self-reported. What did the students think they got out of things? Would you recommend this workshop? And then they did, for one of the groups, they did this is where you were referring, Eric, earlier, to trying to get to that second stage, like, does it change behavior? So for, I think it was the second group, they did a 3-month follow-up, asking them to reflect back which of the exercises that you did during that workshop have you used on a clinical rotation. And then, you know, just their self-reported memory of, is this something that I used? And, you know, generally pretty positive responses from the students to the course itself, pretty highly rated overall. And then, depending, you know, a moderate use of the skills that were self-reported by the one group of students, you know, somewhere between, like, you know, a quarter to maybe up to, you know, 35–40% of students had reported using, you know, each of the different skills or, you know, kind of tactics that they would have used in the improvisation workshop. So that was the overview of what they did. Did I leave out anything important? I feel like that was the highlights. So yeah, what were your guys' thoughts?
So I thought they actually had a pretty good response rate. I mean, 50% for a survey's, I mean, pretty
Yeah.
good. I think this is one of those things where it's like, it would have been great to have some qualitative, you know, quotes about.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so 84% of responding students reported they had used at least one improvisation skill in their clinical wards, but like, give me more about that. What prompted it? Why did you suddenly decide, or was it spontaneous, unconscious, or was it like one of those things where, oh gosh, it seems like this might be a really good place for me to use a rant, or, you know, whatever. And then, well, what is a rant? Because they only described 2 of those. So I love that. And it just made me kind of wish that they had incorporated some direct quotes or stories from students saying, well, you know, I was on my clinical rotation and I had this one case, and they can shorten it down, but I found myself in a situation where using that ta-da, because I, you know, said something really silly and it just kind of broke the ice, really helped me. And just those kinds of things, I think, would have made it a little bit more.
Can I ask you about that, Catherine? Because I've heard people kind of decry that the idea of collecting like quantitative and qualitative data like that, like doing a survey and asking opening-ended questions. And it's like, I've heard qual people be like, oh, for God's sake, like, you're just like sticking in, you know, quotes that support your quant data, which I agree with what you're saying. And I like that. And I have used that. And so I'm curious if you can explain that to like me and the listeners, like, would you go about adding a qualitative component to something like this?
So I don't necessarily think you have to I mean, I think you could probably do an entire qualitative study just off of the data that they have, right?
Okay.
They obviously did a Likert study. They didn't collect any specific open-ended stuff. But I think in this situation, I'm not necessarily advocating that they do a qualitative piece to it, but that they add something that adds a little bit more meat to that. But maybe that's just me wanting the story, right? Because I had a professor who was very much like, you can't do mixed methods. Nobody should do mixed methods because you can either do quantitative well.
Okay. I thought that might have been you telling us that. Yeah.
Right. But you can't do them both well, which I, as I've grown in my own scholarship, I disagree, because I think I could find a really strong quantitative scholar and I could be the qualitative scholar, and we could do a really good mixed methods paper, maybe not all at a single time. So I guess for this, it's not necessarily that they should have added a qualitative piece to this particular paper. I think they have plenty of qualitative things they could do in a separate paper. But when they say things like 84% of respondent students reported that they had used one improvisation, and they give you a table, it's like, well, maybe just give me a little bit more, right? Like just a little tease of, this particular student reported that they had used the tada because they had an awkward
for
moment.
example, right? Like I would have said the for
Yes.
example. That was my frustration with that, was like, which of these exercises have you used on a clinical rotation? And immediately in my head, I was like, well, in what way did you use that? Right? Like, did you just find a buddy who had taken that class? Be like, you know, it'd be fun right now is to go back and do that rant thing. You know, but like I'm assuming, right, that they weren't just doing the game, but that the students felt like they used that, something about that game or some skills, like maybe the tada, they were like, oh, I screwed up, tada, you know, like maybe. But I would have loved some for examples, you know, and I don't know if they just didn't collect that. But I really, but that's where I was really left wanting more, because I'm trying to imagine like how I use improvisational skills. And it's not like I'm out there playing the games that I used to play. You know, I'm using portions of those skills, or, you know, this is something, you know, the skill that I kind of developed when we were playing that game, and I've thought about it, and I use that in this scenario here. Like I would have loved, like you said, I mean, I think there's a lot of, you know, potential for qualitative analysis here, but even just for example, this is how students it would have been, I think, really helpful, because I'm currently still struggling with what that means. And also, like, how did the students interpret that question? Right? Would the numbers have been higher or maybe lower if, like, so I was just a little bit like, what does that mean? I didn't know what it meant.
This is why qualitative research is so important.
But I also think this is particularly why I think mixed methods is really useful. Right?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Because I've heard that from people too, like, you know, down with mixed methods. I'm like, but that's saying that it's one or the other. And why can't they be complementary? Like in life in general, if you use two different methods and you have two different kind of perspectives or two different ways to describe your data set, isn't that just better? Now, I understand that if you're a qualitative researcher, maybe you're not an amazing quantitative researcher, but we can be friends with each other, right?
Yes. It's like using balanced anesthesia or balanced pain, you know, care. It's they make each other better.
One thing.
You don't use one drug for everything. So
I have this strong like aversion resistance when people say no mixed methods. I'm like, but mixed methods sounds perfect for most things.
Yeah, I think so. On behalf of my professor, I think her frustration came from the fact that there was so much bad mixed methods, right? Because she was starting her, and unfortunately she passed away during my PhD program, but she was starting her career at a point where qualitative research just wasn't accepted at all, right? Because it was basically that, oh, just go write something up, it'll get published. And there was no rigor to it. There was no structure. There was no anything to it. And so she was really fighting through this era of, hey, listen, qualitative is legitimate research, right? And it's hard research, and it's just a different kind. And she was actually a psychologist by training. And so she had gone through really rigorous quantitative methodology training. And so she felt like the majority of the work that she had seen that was mixed methods was really just quantitative papers that were pretending to also have qualitative background. And we still see that. I've reviewed a number of qualitative papers that are basically just quantifying qualitative, you know, we did a thematic analysis and 42 of the 52 people said, and it's like, okay, so you're not really doing a thematic analysis. So that's where her resistance came from. And I think it was a legitimate concern. Again, as I've grown in my scholarship, because when I was younger, obviously it was like, oh, she's great, she must know. And you do realize that you can have partnerships with people who, and I've done that with people who were really strong quantitative, who were both interested in the same thing, wanted to figure out, come at it in different directions, and then you just come up with, you know, really interesting work. So,
but I've heard that from other people too. I've heard other people saying mixed, you know, I think that's a pretty common complaint
Yeah.
that people just don't like it. But again, maybe we're not approaching it right. I
Well,
don't
and
think it's
I
inherently
would,
bad about mixed methods.
my experience has been that it's mostly qualitative people who say that, because there is such a fight to get the qualitative side really be validated and valued, but also because there are so many quantitative people who think that qualitative research is easy, and that, oh, well, I read the, Braun and Clark paper on thematic analysis, so now suddenly I'm an expert in in qualitative methods.
Yeah,
So.
no, and I think quantitative methods are more known. People are more familiar with them, so
More comfortable.
yeah, and so if you're going to have a mixed method study, the part that's going to be weak is probably the qualitative portion.
Yeah.
Because I think most, researchers, but also most reviewers are going to be far more comfortable knowing what to do with the quantitative portion. And so those probably just never see the light of day, where you have a really strong qualitative portion and the quant is just terrible. So I can understand that pushback, being like, stop devaluing what we do.
Yeah.
But I think maybe the pushback is a little too extreme sometimes. Really,
Agreed.
yeah, like maybe we can all be friends.
I agree. And I mean, I've had papers that were qualitative that have been reviewed, and I can immediately tell that it's a quantitative person, right? I mean, it definitely, it goes both ways. But
I have to fight the urge all the time. Like I'm constantly like, okay, stop trying to quantify everything about me. Like I mean,
I do it too, when I'm talking about it. It's like, oh, there were 15 methods, and I'm like, oh wait, no, I can't say that. I mean, you can, but you just have to say
that's not the point. Yeah.
That's how we're programmed. But
no, it's true.
But yeah, so I mean, that was, I think it was really interesting. I was really glad that it was published. I think there's good information there. I just wanted more. I wanted more meat. And I kind of got to the point where it's like, I see that this is a brief communication. I'll give them some grace for that, but I wish they would have pushed themselves a little harder and tried to make it a legitimate, like, full research paper where they could have just given us more.
Yeah. I think that says a lot, though, that like we wanted more. Like there was enough there that I was like, there's a lot more to this. Any other thoughts, Eric, on like the kind of the methods and how they went through things? Just make sure we've
I don't know about, so I guess I wanted to talk about the results. I don't have anything to say about the methods. So the two takeaways that I had is their students are really positive. Like I just have the impression of them answering this like, everything is awesome. And I'm like, where do they get these kids? Like, are vet students so different from med students? Like, have we just broken their spirit by the time they're ready for clinics? Because I just can't imagine this kind of enthusiastic response to this activity. Like, I'm just imagining so many eyes rolling if we're like, we're going to do 3 hours of improv training.
No, did you not see in the footnote where one of the researchers was standing over them while they did the survey?
Yeah.
They
were feeding them brownies.
Yeah. That's so funny. I did not think of it in that way, Eric, because I was imagining, I'm like, oh my God, my students would love doing this. Naive me. It was just like, that would be so much fun. They would love this so much.
Well, I was actually thinking, so I'm getting ready to take over our Becoming a Veterinary Professional course next year for the first years. And I was like, maybe I'll incorporate some improv. I'm actually getting ready to do a 5-hour workshop at Tuskegee. And I'm like, I think I should probably incorporate some of that improv that I use. Cause there's this one called the Song in My Head. I don't know if you ever.
I don't know that one.
Okay. So it's the Song in My Head. And it's really useful for professional school teachers who are experts in their fields, right? And so what you do is you select a person from the audience and you hand them a list of really well-known songs and you say, okay, choose one of those songs. And then I want you to tap it out for the rest of the audience, right? We're not going to tell the audience what it is. We're just going to have you tap it out. And so they're tapping and they're like, okay, who knows the song? And they're all like, there's like blank faces, right? And then you say, okay, well, we're going to turn around the list and we're going to show you the list of songs. And then we're going to have the person tap the song out again and then see how many of you can identify it. And then they'll be like, maybe 50% of the people will be able to identify it. And then you say, okay, I'm going to give you a choice between 2 of the songs on the list. And then I'm going to have the person tap it out again. How many of you can identify it? And almost 100% of people in the room can identify it, right? Because when you're tapping it out, it's like, why don't they understand this? Why don't they understand it? Because they're singing it along in their head and they know exactly what's going on. And it's a really good, useful tool that I learned in my improv class with Yvonne, actually, because it's like, listen, the song in your head is not the song that's in the student's head, and you've got to make those songs match. And this is a way that you can make them match, right? So if you don't tell them at all what's going on, they have no idea. If you narrow it down a little bit, they get a better idea. But then if you get it to the point where they just have a choice between a couple of things and they can really figure it out, then they can really get it. And it's like, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. So so I was kind of more like Bobby. I was like, what ways can I incorporate this?
I know.
But it wasn't quite that they would love it. I was kind of in between. It was like, how can I incorporate this? And will they potentially respond the same way that these students did? Or are they going to hate it? Right.
So one of the things that I was imagining, though, right, if you're going to have a course like this, is you pick a couple of the professors and you have them do some of the stuff too, right? Who wouldn't love to see some of their instructors get up there and do some of these games? Like, are you kidding? Like embarrass themselves in front of this? Like, they would love that. They would absolutely. I'm pretty sure they would.
What I hear you saying, Bobby, is that you're willing to come and help me with multiple sessions.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Okay, but I don't know any of their games. I'm trying to like, I have to go back and think of all the games that we used to play. Cause again, ours were not specific, but the skills are still there.
But you know, yes. And I mean, we all know.
Yeah. So there's that. And then, one of the ones that I loved, there's like party guest, you if you've seen like Whose Line Is It Anyway?
Yeah.
Somebody, all the people come in and they're different guests of the party, and the host has to figure out who they are. And then
that would be a good one.
Yeah. Slideshow is one that I actually really enjoy. So slideshow, where one person is the presenter and like, the rest of the team, like 3, 4, 5 people are the slides. And so like, you're up there presenting, and we used to say click, because you're clicking to the next slide, click, and then everybody would move and then freeze. And then you as the presenter have to describe what this slide is. Oh, so that like, so it's like, I can make that an educational, game that
I feel like the 3 of us should get together and like put a workshop together and present it at like AVMA or something, and just why not?
Well, so that was the second takeaway that I got was, holy crap, these results are extremely strong. Every veterinary educator needs to be doing this constantly.
Right?
Right? Like, I mean, the results are bonkers. Like 96% of the students, would recommend this workshop and they thought it was helpful. And like all these things are in the 90 percentiles. Like if you had a clinical trial effect that had something like this, everyone would be doing it.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, I think everyone should be doing improv workshops.
No, I mean, seriously, I'm actually like half serious about us getting together and putting together a workshop and trying to present it somewhere at AVMA or AAVMC or something. We could probably pilot in the Becoming a Veterinary Professional class and just kind of see, but then do a workshop on it or something. Cause
I think it's doable. I think it would take some time to like come up with some specific games and what would we have them do? And I do think you could kind of increase the motivation by making it really interesting and bringing some professors in that especially, so I would do it for sure, but I don't think it would shock most of your students for me to go up there and do that. But if we could find somebody who it would shock them to get in there and doing it, would be fantastic,
I think there are a few.
I think, but I bet we could convince them, right?
I bet we could. Yeah.
And so I think that would be really fun as well. And then, kind of break the ice a little bit. Like, hey, if my professors can get up here and embarrass themselves a little bit, then maybe it's not such a big leap for me. Now, what I do worry about, and this is what I did find surprising, Eric, was like, where are all of like the like super duper introverts who are like, I want nothing to, I mean, there were a couple, and I don't know if those were the people who are like, I have like, this is terrible. And I can't believe you made me do this. And it's this borderline abuse. Like, I don't know if they just had such a small percentage or if they structured it in such a way that they really felt safe, that this was, organized in such a way. So,
that was the 50% of students who didn't respond.
Yeah, but if you hated this course,
so the 50% response was on the 3 month later response.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. No,
Their immediate response rate was like 120 or 130 out of 170 or something.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I am that super duper introvert who does roll my eyes at this kind of stuff. I don't like role playing. I don't like having to get up and do things with other people that I don't know. Like it's kind of my worst nightmare in a lot of ways. Second only to getting stuck in an elevator with a bunch of strangers, which has actually happened. So I think, but what I will say is that when I went through the improv course that I went through, I partly did it to challenge myself because I knew I was going to be really uncomfortable, but there were some exercises we did that were much more introvert friendly. So like one of the exercises we did was we paired up with somebody and we weren't allowed to talk. And I think there was one that they talked about that was sort of similar to this, but we weren't allowed to talk, but I think this is actually the mirroring class or the mirroring exercise. So what you do is you do hand movements with your partner, and one person is supposed to start leading and then you're supposed to switch back and forth. But at some point during that exercise, you should no longer have to tell who's leading and who's not leading, because you should just be getting to a point where you're actually just following those motions.
You're both following the other person.
Yeah. And it's a silent exercise. You're not having to talk. You're not having to touch anyone. You're not having to do anything. You're just in a partner group with everybody else concentrating on their partner. And so that was a really sort of introvert friendly thing. And that experience was actually really good for me because I had a partner, and we actually at the end of that exercise, one of the instructors came up and was like, I was totally mesmerized by you as a pair because you were so in sync, and I could tell that you knew at any given time what was going on. So can you help me understand how that happened? And we had to just sort of sit and think about it. And I was like, well, we just sort of kept it simple and we didn't do any, and just kind of make this description. So I think you can do some exercises that are introvert friendly. And hope that some of those introverts are willing to get out of their shells. But it was a challenge for me, for sure.
Yeah.
I will say that. So,
but I mean, you're still speaking pretty highly of it.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a terrible experience. It wasn't like, I wouldn't necessarily volunteer to do it on a regular basis, but I do think it's possible to make you feel safe enough, to kind of do
So
that.
instead of in your becoming a veterinarian course, like, could you do this in your orientation to clinics? Because that's what their setting was. Because we have a fairly substantial amount of time that the juniors spend prepping for entering clinics that I imagine, I mean, it would be tough to carve out 3 hours, but that's how you'd have to do it.
I don't think we really orient our students to clinics
They used to have a course and it's kind of gone away, and now it's like peppered in a few different things. But there is an advantage to doing it right before clinics also, because now the students know each other a little better.
Yeah.
And so, it's the further along in the curriculum, the more comfortable hopefully they would feel with one another. I guess that could backfire, but I would think so in general. They're gonna be like, yeah, these.
Well, for us, our students go into clinics in the summer between their second and third years, and the Becoming a Veterinary Professional course actually, the third session of that is the semester before they go into clinics.
So you could just, work it into the last portion of that. When they've gotten to know each other a bit better, and I think you could have some fun with it. It wouldn't even have to be 1 3-hour workshop. You could have it over separate sessions and kind of build on it. So I think, I don't know. I think there's potential for it. Again, I'm super duper biased. But again, this was highly rated, and
I think I'm jaded because I've tried to do things adjacent to this and gotten, I don't know if I'd say a lot of pushback, but in the cardio course, I had a lecture about communication. And it's like, okay, like, how do you tell someone that their dog is dying of heart failure? Like, how do you tell a producer that they have high altitude disease? Like, how do you communicate these things that are tough diagnoses to share? And how do you communicate diagnostics and yada, yada, yada. And then I had them do a reflection, have them do a prepared activity and do a reflection about it. And some of the students liked it, but some of them were like, this is dumb. I'm here to learn cardiology. Why am I doing this?
Well, I feel like you had that experience with the students with some of the spec grading stuff too that we went through. So maybe you had a batch of students. I don't know. Every class has its own personality.
I literally got an email from a student the other day because I do the same thing, Eric. So in my third year and I don't know what year that was, but in my third year ECC course, I have 2 different discussion periods where I present them with emergency clinical, scenarios, and they're like real-ish, I mean, the names have been, protected, but I'm like, these are things that have happened to me. And they're, and I'm like, so what are you going to do? And I had a student email me last week that was like, by the way, really love the communication portion of this. I wish we had more of these types of things. And cause I like it just for what you described, it's peppered in with this topic. Okay. So what are some communication things that are relevant to this particular field? And now that's obviously one student, but overall, like, I think over the years, I've gotten good feedback from the students that they like those portions. And I don't know if it's because it's a little break from all the other stuff we're doing. There's probably some that are like, I'm just supposed to be learning, the medicine, but they're pretty quiet in my group, at least. I don't know.
Maybe it's just you, Eric. Maybe it's just you.
Well, and like you
It
said,
usually is. That's usually the
totally
answer.
kidding.
Like, I'll do something and other people are like, yeah, that worked really great for me. I'm like, it didn't for me. And I know this, that like, I read different to people. Like, the students love me on clinics and hate me in lecture. So it's like, all right.
Interesting. That's so interesting.
But what I used to have some of that, like years ago, where they didn't like me in the classroom at all. And I was like, just wait till you get into clinics. You're going to like me. All the same things that you don't like about me in the classroom are the exact things you're going to like about me in the clinic, where I'm like, you are going to learn, you're going to do all this stuff. And I want you to know this really well. But in the classroom, they're like, you're making me do all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah. And in clinics, they're like, you're making me do all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm not just watching. So I was like, it's the same thing. You're complaining about it over here. And then you're like celebrating.
Yeah.
But okay.
Maybe it's just the environment, right? I was totally kidding, Eric. It's not you. I really think that there's something about the 4 walls of a classroom or a laboratory that just, for whatever reason, makes things less fun, and I think you could do exactly the same thing in a classroom and a clinical situation, and the students would respond completely differently, because for some reason now it's real when they're in the clinic, but it's just not real when they're in the classroom or lab. And so, I mean, I would suspect that it has more to do with that, and that those folks who said that might later on, and they may never admit it to you, but they might later on be like, oh man, I was in Hoffmeister's class and he talked about this in cardiology and I was kind of hard on him, but boy, I'm really glad he did,
Well, I also know where in the curriculum was it, right? Like, was it before they'd had a taste of clinics? Because I have the students I'm talking about right now were on clinics for a little bit and then came back. So that very well could have impacted why they're like, I see now why this is valuable. Right. Where in the first couple of years, they're like, we just want to learn the anatomy, like, so I wonder if that's part of it, but I would say don't give up on that, because I actually think a lot of you probably, I suspect that there are more of your students who appreciated that than maybe you're aware of. And as Catherine said, maybe they don't appreciate it till later, but it's so important, and communication should just be peppered throughout the whole darn curriculum.
That's what we were trying to do. Like every course, has a class or 2 about communication. Yep.
Your students were just kind of buttheads then, I guess.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, it's the same thing with, like, if you're talking about DEI, right? It shouldn't just be a single thing or a single committed session. It's just something that should be peppered out throughout the curriculum. It should be part of the curriculum. And yet when you try to do it, I'm dealing with students now who are complaining because we had one professor who took 2 minutes out of the first part of class to talk about, some Black History Month celebration things. And then they slammed her because it was like, well, those 2 minutes, and that 2 minutes turned into 5 minutes that you took to talk to us about DEI stuff means that you didn't get through all of your slides and now you're testing us on those. And it's just like, and so I had to, sort of moderate that. And it's just like, I can't tell her not to say that, but I can say, probably shouldn't say it during designated class time, do it before class or after class. But in my head, I'm like, but this is what we should be doing. We should be relating everything we do to, why it's important.
And how do we do it? How do we make it relevant to them? Like, right. So, there's different things that we can do to make sure to try to, increase the relevance. Like, this is why this matters to you. I like,
that's a good point.
Talking like with like unconscious bias and stuff like that is actually not talking about it in the context of race, talking about it in the context of you're judging the client based on how they're dressed and now you're making
how they're dressed, what they drove in.
Yes.
Yep.
And you're
And
going
purse
to
they're carrying. Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yep. And so, and people go, oh yeah, I guess that is a thing. And then you can expand it from there.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I'm gonna get us back a little back
yeah.
on track.
Well, I has to.
Yeah. So anything
The
else about
results were
the paper
amazing.
that you want to talk about, Bobby?
The results were amazing. Yeah. And the students also mostly reported gaining insight into their role as a physician, which I thought
But
was
what does that
interesting.
mean?
I know. That was one of the things I wanted to hear more about, because I was like, what, like, what did they think? And so, I mean, I think that's amazing that they got that result, but yeah, I wanted to know so much more about that, because that's the point, right? Like that was the whole point. I was like, but tell me why they thought that, like what specifically. So yeah, I definitely wanted to dig into that a little bit more. And then they did, I think they did a good job of saying, look, these are our limits. We know we only did this first part, and we know this is student reporting, and we know that there's potential for issues there. And we really do think it's important to look at what is the impact on how they're actually performing in the clinic and as physicians, and what is the impact on, patients and their families and that sort of thing. So they acknowledge that, that they're just, scratching the surface of what, we really need to know about this, which is what we all do at the end of our papers, right? And then here's the 30 more studies that need to be done to answer the question. But I mean, I think they were right on the money there. But it's a good start. I think it's a cool start. It's one of those things where I'm like, I'm glad they shared this. And I think it's a great idea, and could maybe, just the fact that students liked it, right? Like, hopefully that would make you, Eric, be like, well, maybe that is something they'd be okay with, or you come back and you're like, well, 90% of our students said it was terrible. So why? Now we have to try to dig in a little bit more and figure out why that was. But anyhow, so I thought it was pretty exciting. But yeah, I just wanted more. That was the overall impression from this paper. Other thoughts?
Awesome. I think that's a great summary.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it was a fun one for me. I think, yeah, there was some good, stuff to discuss, and now we've got more projects on our to-do. Is anybody keeping track of our to-do list that we come up with at the end? I think in every one of these talks,
I'm adding to like our research, or my research list, and then our topics for this podcast.
Excellent. So we're never going to run out of either of these.
No.
That's the fun part. That's
material.
why I love having these discussions. We do go off the rails, and thank you, Eric, for bringing us back. But sometimes when we go off the rails, fun things come up. So
for sure.
Thanks for listening, and we will catch you all next time.